Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Lois here and today I'm going to be painting this stormy sky with clouds blowing in across a river with just a loose riverbank in the foreground. It's a really simple scene, but the little touches work really nicely, like the salt effects in the foreground produce little flowers that show up against the dark cloud shadow in the river. This lovely simple painting is very beginner friendly. Just have a go. Don't worry if it doesn't work out first time. It's more important to just be adventurous and expressive and give it a try. I'm going to wet the page all over with the sky, leaving a few sort of dryish patches. I think you can see if you look carefully on the screen. It's slightly darker where the water is on the paper. And then I'm just going to bring the water across the river, but I'm not going to paint any water into the foreground yet. This is raw sienna. A nice light value of raw sienna just across the sky so that it will take away from that white of the paper, and when my Payne's grey goes in, it just should give me a lovely sort of glow and help to give me some variation in the colour of those clouds. This nice dark value of Payne's grey, I'm putting it on with a size 18 mop brush and pushing the paint around the sky, painting around the clouds. I will close in a lot more, so there'll be less clouds towards the end, but I'm starting off by just bringing the paint around those cloudy areas. I want a really softly diffused sky, but I still want it to be nice and dark grey in places, particularly across the top and on the left side, just to suggest these storm clouds sort of rolling in across the horizon. Now my paint is starting to run down the page because my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. So I'm going to rotate the board 90 degrees and stand it on its end. Now the paint will begin to flow in that direction. And I can sort of soften back here and there where it's maybe ran down the page a little bit too much, and then add some really nice rich paint across what will be the top of the sky and blend that in nicely. I'm working quickly because I have a limited time to get this wet in wet sky in because it's quite warm here, so my paper is drying quite quickly. Just a little bit darker into the river so I get some cloud reflections on this side on the left of the heavier clouds in the sky on the left. Now turning my paper back round the normal way, and now I've squeezed all the water out of my brush and I'm going to pull the damp brush across the horizon line just to sort of flatten it out there. And then using the damp brush, I can just take off that bead of water and paint across there. Now on to the foreground. I've mixed a green from cad yellow and ultramarine blue and a touch of burnt sienna. And this is a round brush, it's a size 14 round, and I'm dragging it across the foreground, trying to get some dry brush, dipping it into water, and then sort of scratching and scribbling it across the foreground and slowly beginning to build up the impression of texture. And dipping into a bit more water, running it carefully along the line where the paint is still wet, where the river is, and I should get those two edges to soften and merge, which should give a lovely sort of blended effect. I hope you can see how the really dark clouds in the sky are now reflected below in the river. So now I want to get some dark shadows into the foreground. So more Payne's grey, and I'm painting that in wet, and it should soften and diffuse. And a nice big sort of splash of raw sienna gives some variety to that green and adds a little bit of interest to the foreground. My paper is Saunders Waterford cold pressed watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, but now that my painting has got to a stage where I like the look of it and I don't want it to run down the page anymore, I've laid my painting completely flat. This will stop the paint from running, and the washes should more or less settle where they are. And just checking that my horizon is nice and flat. And just before I leave it all to dry, I'm taking a clean damp flat brush. It's the 3/4 inch flat, and I'm dragging the tips through the river and lifting out some paint, and that will give me some highlights, some sort of like cloud where the light is shining through the storm clouds reflected on the river, and just a few little marks like that will make quite a difference in sort of making the river look a lot more convincing than it looks at the moment. As it dries, hopefully that little bit of light will really give the impression of water. And now I'm going to use my palette knife and just scrape a few little grasses through my foreground here and there, not too many, just enough to add a little bit of texture. And I'll be adding some ordinary table salt there soon, but I'm going to make sure that I leave my paint to almost dry. I want my paint to be just damp when I add the salt, because I don't want large salt effect blooms. I want the effects to be quite subtle, so I shall be looking for it to be almost dry and then just sprinkling a tiny amount of table salt onto the foreground and keeping it really careful and making sure that only a few little grains go into the river area, because those will provide me with my tiny little flowers as the salt grains push away the paint and will give me those tiny blooms against the dark grey cloud shadows in the river. Now I need to leave it to dry completely. So here it is, it's dried, and I've lifted the board back up to 45 degrees again, and I'm really pleased with the way it's looking. It's looking really stormy and atmospheric. I love the windswept look of all the plants just suggested on the riverbank. But now I'm going to paint in a distant headland, so I've mixed up a little bit of Payne's Grey mid-value, and I'm using my size 14 round brush to carefully sweep a brush stroke with a few sort of lumpy bits to represent just distant trees on the far side of the riverbank. And then what I'll do is I'll run along underneath that brush stroke, that dark mark, and just soften it back a little bit so it sort of blends into the riverbank a little bit more, so it's not quite so dark looking or stark looking. That's better. And now with the rigger brush, just 2 or 3 little birds just suggested against lighter parts of the sky, just wheeling in on the wind. This is a size 2 rigger. It's a Pro Art rigger, and a really nice brush. And that's it, finished. A really nice simple painting, and certainly one that I think it's worth beginners having a try at. It's important here to make sure that you try and mix up the right value of paints. You want really nice dark values for the sky, particularly the clouds, and get that difference in value with the river going from dark on the left and getting a lot lighter across the right. And if you can see, those tiny little salt blooms have given us flower details which are really pretty. And this sort of something and nothing loose foreground works really well with a loose painting like this. And it doesn't take much work to create it. With the dry brush here in the foreground on the right, works really beautifully to balance out the flowers on the left. And then, of course, if we take a closer look at the sky, you can see the tiny birds painted with the rigger in the right sort of scale for the painting, nice and small, and they look better, they show up better if you select a lighter part of the sky to paint them in. Well, I hope you enjoyed this really quick, easy, beginner's loose watercolour painting. Let me know what you think in the comments. I always love to read your comments, even if I don't have time to reply to them all. Thank you so much for your support. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, because it really helps with our reach. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. You can support Morgana on Patreon by following the link above, and you can support me by following the link just below that as well. So thank you so much. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.